expression no self that the Tathagatas, the Arhats, the fully enlightened ones, proclaim the teaching of the Tathagata Garbha as a projectionless realm devoid of fabrications. Mahamati bodhisattvas of the present and the future should not become attached to any view of a self.
She is unbowing. Take, for example, a porter who applies such things as manual labor, water, a stick, a wheel, and a string to a lump of clay to make different kinds of vessels. The Tathagata is also like this, applying wisdom and a variety of skillful means to what has no self and is free from projection. Sometimes I speak about the Tathagata Garbha, and sometimes no self. Thus, the Tathagata Garbha, of which I speak, is not the same as the self spoken of by followers of other paths. This is what is meant by the teaching of the Tathagata Garbha. The Tathagata Garbha is taught to attract those members of other paths who are attached to a self, so that they will give up their projection of an unreal self and will enter the threefold gate of liberation and aspire to attain unexcelled, complete enlightenment forthwith. This is why the Tathagatas, the Arhats, the fully enlightened ones speak in this manner about the Tathagata Garbha. To speak otherwise would be to agree with the followers of other paths. Therefore, Mahamati, in order to avoid the views of followers of other paths, you should rely on the selfless Tathagata Garbha. Bowing.
Shokabani, thank you. And Senchu, do you have time to read through the second paragraph in the footnote?
Mm-hmm. Senchu bowing. Wait, just the second paragraph in the footnote?
Yep. The second paragraph, and then I think there's only one footnote there. 299.
Okay. 299 corresponds with intrinsic nirvana or similar expressions. The Buddha varies his description of the Tathagata Garbha depending on the attachments of his audience. For those attached to existence, the Tathagata Garbha is empty, formless, or intentionless. For those attached to non-existence, the Tathagata Garbha is the realm of reality, the Dharma nature, or the Dharma body. For those attached to existence and non-existence, it is nirvana, the absence of self-existence, or what neither arises nor ceases. And for those attached to neither existence nor non-existence, it is original quiescence or intrinsic nirvana. Bowing.
Shokabani, does anyone know the definition of quiescence?
Yeah, it's a quietness, a quietude, I think is right.
Mm-hmm.
A quiescence is a period of quietness. If that makes sense
I don't know.
in context. I mess around with this.
Alright, I have it. Lisa Bowing, a state of quiet, but possibly temporary, in action. Quiet and inactive restfulness. Bowing.
Shokabani, so at the end of the footnote when it says for those attached to neither existence nor non-existence, it is original quiescence or intrinsic nirvana. How would that definition in talking about the Tathagata Garbha as original quiescence be helpful for those who are attached to neither existence nor non-existence?
Sokuzan said, well, peace is already the case. You don't have to create peace or make peace because it's already the case. So that's the sense I get here, is that for those who basically see what this is, then the way to describe it, just since as close as we can in the relative world, is that original quiescence of quiet stillness.
Shokubang, it's really interesting that they talk about all the different ways that they can talk about the Tathagata Garbha and in relationship to attachment. He says the Buddha varies his description of the Tathagata Garbha depending on the attachments of his audience. And he goes on to list several different kinds: emptiness, formlessness, intentionlessness. So it seems like if all of these spring forth or spring out of the basic understanding of Tathagata Garbha, how does the Tathagata Garbha differ from all of these expressions, if they even do differ? Bowing.
Bowing. This whole section, we've read it a couple times, and here again, it reminds me of when Sokuzan said, meet people where they're at. So it sounds like that the Buddha is really in tune with who his audience is and what their understanding of is or isn't. And so he, it's kind of like he throws a monkey wrench into things. At least that's how it looks to me. So if you're attached to non-existence, then we'll talk about the realm of reality. And if you're attached to existence, then we'll talk about non-existence. So it's just, he sounds very clever to me.
Totally bowing. What I just thought of is, how do you then tailor that to a group? Like, that seems fine if there's a specific belief held in someone, but if you're talking to 8 people, how are you to know what those beliefs are held of each person? And yeah, I don't know. Wondering how that's done. Bowing.
Geez, I'd be curious if that's kind of a problem that has arisen with time, because back then it seemed like everyone probably had a sect or a religion or a school that they followed, whereas now when you get 10 people in the room, like, some of them have a Christian upbringing, some of them have atheist, like, so I wonder, that's a really good question. I wonder if that's more of a newfound question now that people are not so homogenous in their beliefs. Bowing.
When you're bowing, I wonder too if perhaps it doesn't show up like, here again, when Sokuzan asks for questions, and then based on who's asking the question, then that comes forward, the teaching that they need. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of cultural situation laid out here that we're not real privy to. Bowing.
Shokubang, so how does someone see the
Lisa bowing, it seems like that's where not to would come in. If you're not separate from the person you're facing, then you would sort of inherently understand where they're coming from and talk in a way that meets them where they're at. Lisa bowing.
Bailey Bowing, could you repeat your question, Shoka?
Shokabang, yes, I just have to remember. How does someone see the attachment that somebody has in such a way to where they can talk about the Tathagata Garbha through these different forms? They seem to be very specific: realm of reality, Dharma nature, emptiness. It's confusing to me to understand how to see in such a way to use these very specific concepts. Shokabang. So, for example, one of the ones that we quite often talk about is emptiness, and then it seems like some of the other ones, like formlessness or intentionlessness, I don't hear so much, specifically with an intentionlessness. So, like, what kind of a situation would somebody use the teaching of intentionlessness to help somebody with their attachment?
Lisa bowing, what the word intentionlessness brings up for me is the idea that Sokuzan talks about not doing anything like unless you have to. And so if you find yourself in the moment moving towards an action without thought, you haven't sat and thought about what you need to do, and now I'm going to get up and do this thing. So there's no intention behind it. There's simply action unattached to intention. And so I think it's, in each case, it seems like what's described in the footnotes is that these things would be used for people with attachments in the opposite direction. So if they're attached already to existence, then he's going to use the really amorphous, malleable ideas to describe Tathagata Garbha, because you've got somebody who's already, attached to the physicality of things, and then, but if they're not attached to the physicality, if they're attached to non-existence, then he draws them back in the other direction, and says, yeah, but right here, there's, reality too that you have to deal with. And so it seems like in each case, he kind of pulls whoever he's talking to off balance by bringing up things on the opposite side of the coin, to maybe get them to see both sides at the same time. So maybe the intentionlessness, if it's somebody who, like me, likes to plan and really hates going out without a plan, he might be pointing out intentionlessness to me. But somebody else who's, pretty free form doesn't need to see intentionlessness. They already work that way, so he'd go with something else. Lisa bowing.
Cody bowing. I was thinking along those same lines for intentionlessness, like attitudes of like fate, that everything is just meant to be this way, or there's nothing that I can do about it, and kind of feeling helpless toward the world. Maybe a teaching of intentionlessness might help. That's what I thought of bowing.
Lisa bowing. I find the thing that's interesting is that the Buddha doesn't actually explain any of that. He just says, here's the different terms or concepts I would use depending on who I'm talking to. And then it's Red Pine who kind of explains to us, well, here's what he's seems to be, implying is that, you have this one little clump of concepts and he'd apply that to these people, or you have a different clump of concepts and he'd apply that to these other types of people who have a different type of attachment. So I wonder if the Buddha assumed Mahamati got that part without him having to go into detail, because in other places he seems to like go into extreme detail and say the same thing like 8 different ways. And then here it's like, well, just gloss over this. Lisa bowing.
Shokubang, and that kind of brings me back to a concept or a term that Unyo used, talking about throwing a monkey wrench into something. So what is happening with that kind of monkey wrench feeling whenever we're kind of being taught in a different direction?
Bailey bowing, to use a couple of other phrases. It seems like the intention is to dislodge something in our preconceived idea about how the world works. Or it sometimes feels like the rug is being pulled out from underneath us. Like maybe we can think our way to a certain point with concepts, and then we grasp onto that level of understanding. But to go deeper requires kind of a falling off the cliff.
Lisa bowing. I was going to mention that the pulling the rug out idea. You think you're walking on something solid. Somebody pulls the rug. All of a sudden it's not so solid. And it kind of forces you to look at what you decided was and wasn't solid underneath you, what was suitable for walking on. And I think it's the same kind of idea. If you're holding on to an idea of what reality is, if you have this attachment, then you need to be pulled off balance, have that rug pulled out to show you that this isn't as solid as you thought it was. Lisa bowing.
Sokukoji said she's bowing out to go to work.
Senju bowing.
And you're bowing. So, in regards to that, what is the value then of being thrown off balance? How does that help relieve suffering? Well,
Lisa bowing. For me, it doesn't. It increases. I hate being thrown off balance, but it forces me to look at my preconceptions, and hopefully, in the long term, maybe it'll decrease my suffering by forcing me to be able to look at things, at least in this one moment, and see that the story I thought that was right isn't all there is. And maybe hopefully I'll start to think of that idea down the road when other things come up, and maybe I won't have to be thrown quite so violently off balance the next time, because I'll be a little more open to the fact that maybe what I think isn't all there is. Lisa bowing.
I'm buying. Sounds teaching of no position comes up for me. Just that if you're off balance, it means that you had a position. It seems that if you're not fixated on any position, you really can't be thrown off balance because there's no point of origin that you're trying to stay at or return to. So for me, it just points out fixation. Still trying to get a hold of that which is constantly in motion. Bowing.
Sokukoji, is there a difference between something like fixation on a view and fixation of a self? Bowing.
Bailey bowing. It seems like we can have many fixations on different views or different stances on things that are more likely to change, and that all of those surrounding fixations kind of serve the center of the fixation to a solid self. Bowing.
Does anybody remember what we were reading the other day that was talking about everything being a form of consciousness? Bowing. If not, never mind. Bowing. It just seemed that there was something there about everything's a form of consciousness. I don't know what degree we can actually differentiate a self from another projection. But I don't entirely remember.
Sokukoji, he's on.
She isn't bowing. It was from the Wu Tai translation, verse 26. As long as consciousness does not see that subject object distinctions are simply forms of consciousness. Attachment to twofold grasping will never cease. And I was just thinking that it almost sounds like there is no distinction between subject and object, aside from our projections, that they're both forms of consciousness. Maybe that we have to work with self as different from other on the path, but in the end I'm thinking that there's really no distinction between the two forms of illusion. Bowing.
When you're bowing, I cheated and went ahead to 29. Because the Buddha's wrapping everything up in, I think it says basically the same thing as bowing. You may read it? Okay. 29 on page 111. The Buddha then repeated the meaning of this in verse. A continuous person in the skandhas, conditions and motes of dust, the creation of a powerful Lord, projections of nothing but mind. And then the footnote, particularly 302, which Red Pine introduces that short unit or section. He says, short though this section is, the Buddha manages to list the major conceptions of a self held by other paths. Something that continues from one life to the next, something that results from a combination of matter and conditions, or something created by an outside force, all of which are nothing more than fictions. It reminds me of Sukazan's talk last night where he used the example of inside-outside, and he said, look closely. Where is the division of inside-outside? Bowing.
Shokuang, looking at that same footnote, it says something that results from a combination of matter and conditions. Does anybody understand how that's a major conception of a self? Bowing?
Baby bowing. The only thing that's coming up for me is when Zogazan talks about you didn't create your body, so it would be a combination of matter and conditions. So the conditions might be your parents and your parents' parents and all of those past conditions coming together to manifest as a body or matter. Bowing.
When you're bowing, and then the use of, in the verse itself, a mote of dust. If I had any idea of or feeling of superiority, I think that just did it in. Bowing.
Carl Sagan says that same thing. A mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Talking about Earth. Those my 2 cents.
Shokabang, are there any other comments or questions on what's been discussed so far? Bowing?
Lisa Bowing. I think it's kind of interesting that it hits both sides of the creation argument. Either God created us, or we're just a random collection of atoms. So I think both conditions are hit there, or both sides of that particular coin. He hits both of them in with such precision. It's not creation by something else. It's not just the random, collection of atoms that creates you. And it's not the crap in your mind that tells you that you're a solid thing that creates you. All of that is wrong. Lisa Bowing.
There's a cat on your glasses.
Yeah.
I never noticed that.
Oh, they're just cheap Myers readers.
Oh, fly.
Squirrel.
Shokabang, so what would that leave us then, as far as what is true? Bowing.
When you're bowing, not knowing.
Isn't that's how it shows it for me. I think he's trying to take away a platform to rest on by wiping out our possibilities. Bowing.
Shokabang, Gyokudo, would you be able to read the short paragraph at the top of page 111? Bowing.
Dr. Bowing, it is put to an end. No, let me start over. It is to put to an end to the fear foolish beings have about the expression of no self, that the Tathagatas, the Arhats, the fully enlightened ones, proclaim the teaching of the Tathagata Garbha as a projectionless realm devoid of fabrications. Mahamaya should not become attached to any view of itself.
May I mic you, sir?
Certainly.
Where do you like it?
Wherever you want, right there is okay.
So we've been studying the Lankavatara Sutra, and most of our discussion is around a paragraph. Do you mind if I read that paragraph?
Certainly, go ahead.
The Buddha replied, Mahamati, The Tathagata Garbha of which I speak is not the same as the self mentioned by followers of other paths. Mahamati, when I speak about the Tathagata Garbha, sometimes I call it emptiness, formlessness, or intentionlessness, or realm of reality, dharma nature, or dharma body, or nirvana, what is devoid of self-existence, or what neither arises nor ceases, or original quiescence, or intrinsic nirvana, or similar expressions. There was a question that arose out of something that Cody made a comment on, and you also had made a comment on, about wondering if this speaking to a group is differed. Do you happen to remember what that was?
His question.
It's not coming up for me right this second. Yeah.
I think I remember. I think the question was, the Buddha has different teachings for different people depending on where their fixation is, and how you would teach to a group of people when it seems that everyone may be stuck at a different point bound.
Even that group of people gives off a kind of shine or patina about where they're at and who they are. And so it would probably arise, at least in my experience, it arises as looking at a couple of people and understanding from those people. It's like looking at parentheses. You know, you kind of see what your group is. Excuse me, you may respond by any of those terms. Emptiness would be one that would be perhaps more challenging for some people because it looks like a relative emptiness, and then you'd have to go into an explanation. It would depend. So you could say Tathagata, which might not sound any better than emptiness, but yet sets it away so one does not grasp at a relative situation. One realizes there's something to be understood here called whatever, maybe Tathagata Garbha, or the womb of one who comes thusly. And so in that way, you invite people to come into more of the mystery of the whole thing rather than some kind of a flat-out explanation of it. And I could speak to all of those other words also if you have questions about those.
Cody bowing. So are some views better than others?
No, not particularly. If I understand your question, not particularly different. They're just views. Any view is delusion. Every view is here and a view. So, but we have to start somewhere. So we start with a view of things are empty of what we think they are, or life is suffering because his desire the goal in the path. We have to start with some kind of a view to begin with, which is why we have the provisional teachings. And then from there, with individuals, if I'm talking to individuals, I may go in a different direction with one person if I'm talking to them individually than I would with another. And it's not that we're trying to get rid of the view. It's always about awareness. I say this over and over. It's always about seeing that you're operating out of a view. Just like I'm a monk. This is a temple. This is a monastery. There are other people who are monks here. There are people who are lay practitioners. We all come in here and join and work on this situation. So that's a particular view of the teachings is we study them. We look at the concepts. A particular view of spiritual path is we train the mind. So that's a view about that. Not so much an opinion, but just a view. But it's also empty of anything you attribute to it. This is where we're slowly inching our way over to the cliff of seeing there is nothing separate. And that's challenging to the self-centeredness. We don't want to be without a reference point. We don't like that. More.
Bailey bowing. The translation of Tathagata Garbha as womb of one who comes thusly, or womb of Buddhas, that phrase doesn't seem to make any sense to me. It doesn't evoke any imagery.
Does emptiness evoke an image?
A little bit more.
Which one would which one of those would you relate to if you said, okay, I'm going to use a particular one of these? Is there one of them that feels stronger to you in some way?
I guess what neither arises nor ceases. That or emptiness, or formlessness. I don't know.
So that would work. Then don't use Tathagata. Tathagata is a Sanskrit word, ancient word, way of talking about it. Among people who were students in ancient times were probably fairly scholarly and trained in these words and languages. Whereas now we have more of a kind of a natural sophistication just by you're born into a society where there's a lot of emphasis on language and learning and understanding, and there's just so many directions to look. So when we see that which does not arise and that which does not cease, that takes us into a little movement into lack of reference point. Because of giving you a reference point, it's neither this nor that. So it's giving you a little bit, but it also takes it away at the same moment. It does not arise, nor does it cease. Wait a minute, how can something arise and yet not arise, yet not cease? So that takes your mental ruminations into a realm of non-duality or not to, or takes you into Advaita or non-dual, a way of moving the consciousness or the awareness into an area where there are things happening, but it's not a plus or a minus. This happens in dreams, like the reality of a dream, yet it's totally unreal. We wake up and that's completely unreal. There is no red car that's trying to run me down, or whatever. There is, it's not there. But when it was happening, it was there. So so that kind of an understanding, I think, is helpful. It's both real and unreal, not to. Go ahead.
Bailey bowing. So should I not try to bring my conceptual mind to the concept womb of Buddhas?
Yeah, you could still do that. You could do both. You could bring your conceptual mind as you describe it to that and see what happens there. See if that opens up, because that opens up a different way of working with the whole structure of non-duality, or not two, or neither existing nor non-existing, neither not arising, but also not ceasing.
What does womb mean in that context?
The source. And one who comes thusly, or thus, or tatata, which is this root word for Tathagata, it's one who comes, but yet doesn't come from somewhere. It's one who goes, but doesn't go anywhere. So it's that's so when you meet a Tathagata, you're meeting someone who is living beyond time and space, and yet has never gone anywhere, hasn't left it, but yet does not plant his or her feet in that as some kind of a something substantial that can be counted on.
Shokubang, are there any other questions for Sokuzan? Shokubang, two of these expressions that he uses are original quiescence or intrinsic nirvana. What would intrinsic nirvana be?
Nirvana, that's already the case. It's already intrinsic. So look up the word intrinsic. It's with whatever it's not separate from that. It's intrinsic. It's intrinsic to everything. Well, nothing extra, nothing that's extra, either by way of discovery or creation. You can't create it, you can't destroy it. Hasn't been created, can't be created. It's already the case. Here again, what we're doing constantly as we study all of these texts is we're taking the thinking, processing, it is and it isn't kind of mind or mental activity into something that does not confirm our position on anything. Because we're continually looking for some kind of a position of, I think I'm getting this, or something like that. Have you noticed that? It takes a long time to wear that out. Unless your karma is arising such a way that you have done that, we could say, in some other realm, some other place. I'm not here to promote past lives, but I'm not even here to promote present lives. But the realms that we are functioning in are completely vast and permeable. But they're not permeable if you're locked down in your concepts. If you're locked down on what this is, then you're in a self-made container called me and myself and my stuff, and me and my stuff to be taken for granted. But whereas the meditation practice, the study, eventually starts bringing awareness to that wall. And one of the keys to that wall, one of the keys to understanding what that is a word like Tathagata. Contemplate that. The one who comes thusly, the source of that, which is sourceless. It can't have a source. So it's contradictory. It's intrinsically, to use that word, contradictory when you come into the relative truth. So this is why it's so challenging for ego, because we want results. We want to know, well, if I do this, will this work? More.
Shokuban and Gyokudo, do you have any questions on the phone? Don?
No, not at this time, thanks.
Shokuban, any other questions here in the Zendo? Don? Shokuban, at the end of this paragraph, there's a sentence that reads, Mahamati, bodhisattvas of the present and the future should not become attached to any view of a self. Is a bodhisattva able to become attached to the view?
Well, attachment can happen, but it's the awareness. When they're saying don't become attached, it's saying that if the awareness is there, then you'll notice the attachment. It's just seeing the attachment releases the attachment. All you have to do is bring awareness to that. So this is why, excuse me. This is why in the Lanka actually is the stages on the path, stages of Bodhisattva, which I don't particularly teach those, but we refer to them saying, well, here's a way that this is a graduated situation, where the first one is pramudita, or joy, where there's a joy or a relief at seeing that there's no solid self in the skandhas. There is no solid me, and to realize that is profound and vast, and opens up all of the possibility or potential for everything else that's happening within the context of the room you're sitting in. So you're no longer covered up and limited in some way. So someone seeing that might begin to become attached to that joy, or that feeling of being uplifted, because they see that the very struggle they were having with me and my stuff, and me and my fear, and me of just fear, we might because we're still living beings. We're still in a body-mind complex that is subject to the causes and conditions of karma. You can't be free of your karma just because you've realized or awakened. So this is why it's sometimes set up in stages, so that easier for us to approach or to understand, and you may or may not need to reflect on those or think of those. I don't think it's important to go in, because then we start measuring each other. One of the things I noticed right away when I first heard about these back in the 1970s is no one ever said, well, I'm on the third bhumi. Which one are you on? I know one time Trungpa Rinpoche was asked in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the first 1973 seminary that happened there, we're talking about the bhumis, and someone asked him, the Teton Mountains were there, and he was asked, so Rinpoche, what bhumi are you on? He said, Teton bhumi. So you're not about to be pinned down with anything. So, but that way of talking about it shows you, and showed me when I first read that, it's just an index. We don't really need to measure and see which part of the path am I on, what am I. Because there's always the consciousness, the awareness is stretched between all kinds of things. There might be some kind of consolidation going on over here, and then there might be some other kind of dynamic that is causing that consolidation to start to come apart and crumble. And what do I say? Awareness, awareness, awareness. Just aware. Just aware. It will feel like failure, more than likely, to ego. It feels like this is really getting anywhere. This is difficult. This is challenging. I'm still having these emotions that they won't go away. And so we all have some. You have your own version. It might not sound like that. That's what mine look like. And they're still there. They might come, they might not. I'm not concerned. But I teach out of it. I talk about it because I know that's what it seems to take to be able to transcend this, is to be aware. To be aware of the fixation. To be aware of the locking down. Not to stop it. Not to get rid of it. Very sneaky, isn't it? Darn. Further questions?
Lisa, bowing.
Yes.
Once you're on this path, is everything that comes up path?
Yes. Everything is the path, and that's a good question. Totally is the path. Going outdoors, running, having difficulty in traffic, having waking up and being kind of swamped by some kind of maybe negative energy that doesn't seem to have any source for it. Because what's happening is there is an opening that happens because of the inspiration to be on this path. The inspiration, this is working on all kinds of levels that aren't traceable through consciousness, through the consciousness that looks the 3/16th of an inch of consciousness, when really there's thousands of miles of consciousness that are not that it's not aware of itself. So we're kind of trapped. The ego has us trapped in this little whirlpool of me. And so that's the beginning of it. So we begin to see that, and it starts to get larger, and then sometimes the awareness just shoots out way away from that self-centeredness into an area that where it might be a hell realm, it might be a jealous God realm, it might be a realm that hasn't been described particularly. And so you'll go there, and the inspiration through the sitting practice of meditation, through the encouragement of one's teacher, through the encouragement of the Sangha, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through this structure, and through the aspiration to save all beings, be with all things, we don't do anything with that. We're fine if we find ourselves flashing into some other realm that might be scary or painful. We don't add anything to it necessarily. And if we do spontaneously add on, we don't add on to that. So don't correct the correction. Or as Trungpa Rinpoche would say, double negativity. The first negativity is negative enough. You don't need anything else but that. And the first negativity is you could say it this way, is actually without a self, because it's coming out of karma. It's not coming out of present, necessarily out of your present projection to save yourself or protect yourself.
And you're bowing, so just the idea of progress on the path.
Yes.
So when something occurs, that maybe a negative feeling, and we react out of anger or whatever, and then perhaps after we don't like how we reacted, is there some beneficial way to assess the action?
Don't assess, to start with. Don't assess, but also don't look away from it. As soon as you assess anything, this is how the awareness, what happens to the awareness. You're looking at it, and then you begin to assess and you cover up the awareness. You actually go into an assessing mode, which is separation. Not that you couldn't do that, but that's assessing. You're slowly training yourself to be able to assess without dropping out of sight. To be able to look at something and not ignore anything else. Generally speaking, human beings, when they're looking at something, listening to something, they're ignoring everything else. Or?
I'm just trying to get a sense of how that occurs.
All right.
Something arises, we have a sharp awareness, and then we find ourselves in action of one
Yes.
type or another. It's difficult not to go back and, at least for me, and say, "Oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that," sort of thing.
Well, it's not saying you can't do that. Just allow the awareness to be there with it. Allow the awareness, you could say, to be primary rather than trying to fix it or be a better person. Or this is very circular. It's not that people shouldn't try to be more kind. I mean, it's on some level, and try to interfere with other people's, don't meddle with people and give people the benefit of the doubt. But that's something that actually is more of a non-doing rather than something you're doing. And so I'm saying you could bring that same kind of non-doing into the arena of where this so-called mistake is occurring, and just look at the tangle. Look at the tangle without correcting, because if you correct too quickly, what you're actually doing is you're trying to be a better guy. You're trying to be a person who doesn't do anything wrong. I'm not saying you personally, but we tend to want to correct something, and what's happening on the mundane path, of course, that can even be accomplished on some level. But in the spiritual path, everything is grist for the mill of awareness. Everything is to be seen as path, like Lisa was asking about. It's just the path. It's always opening up and opening up and opening up. More. So you might have that negativity, and you would just look at that. By looking at that clearly and seeing what that is, I can stretch the story out a little more and might be helpful to you. By doing that, what you're exercising is the viewing of all of the particles and pieces and interstices, gaps between things, all of the things that make up that particular situation, rather than filling that all up with your ideas, your opinions, and your desire to control. So you're actually, I rarely use this word, but I'm going to say it here. You're actually surrendering to the negativity, which ego doesn't want to do that. But you're going to give up because you want to know what it is. You're willing to have the ego be under intense threat because you are prioritizing awareness over your protecting your self-centeredness. Most people are not doing that. Most people are protecting their self-centeredness all the time. At the same time they're practicing, they have a protection going on. So the negativity arising, or the so-called mistake or difficulty or stepping over the line or getting into someone else's territory, that's the path. That's everything. Bring everything to the path. That's what's being talked about in Atisha's 7 Points of Mind Training, when Atisha talks about bringing everything to the path. Whatever happens, bring it to the path of awareness. So then, you could say it this way, so then when something similar happens, you kind of have an understanding of how that works. Because the last time that something happened where you maybe got too aggressive with some situation or some person, you, instead of trying to change it or be somebody different or correct yourself or scold yourself or feel ashamed, you actually use that as a way of deepening your awareness around how that works. So then when something similar comes up, you kind of sense an echo there. You sense some kind of resonance that you're starting to recognize what that is, and you understand not to meddle with that once the impulse that has kind of taken you over. Once that's happened, then don't do it anymore. Don't try to stop that. Don't try to shut that down, or don't add on any more negativity on top of it. Is that helpful? Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shoko bowing. Any other questions for Sokozan? Bowing. Okay, so we can go ahead and bow. Thank you, Sokozan, for joining us.
Certainly. Thank you for having me here.